In this video, we'll cover the basics of the Express framework, which I think is the most popular Node.js web framework. According to NPM, their weekly downloads is 14 million something. So even if it's not the most popular, I think it's pretty darn popular. So before we get to the Express framework, let's talk about something we already know. Here is actually what a servlet hello world looks like. We have a doGet method here, and it takes two arguments, a request and a response. It sets a content type and writes hello world into the response. And here is a hello world web application written in Node.js. So let's first run it and make sure it works. So let me copy over this code and paste it here, and let's run it. Go to Node, and the file name is webapp.js, webapp.js. And then let's go to localhost 8080, and we guess hello world here. And let's change this to CS5220, just make sure we are getting the response from this one. Refresh, CS5220. Okay, so this code indeed works. If we take a closer look at the code, we can see that it's actually remarkably similar to the servlet code. Similar to the servlet code, we have a function here, and this function takes two arguments, a request and response, and it sets a content type header, and it writes hello world to the response. This similarity shows that no matter what language you use, at the end of the day, a web application is really about taking a HTTP request as input and producing a HTTP response as output. Now, with that said, there is a big difference between this Node.js web program and this servlet. In servlet, we write a web application, then deploy it to a server like Tomcat. With Spring Boot, the server is embedded in the application, which saves us the trouble of deployment. Now with Node.js, the application actually is the server. As we can see in this code, the HTTP package of Node.js lets us to create a server that handles HTTP requests and responses. And the application like this simply adds additional functionality to the server. There's one more thing we need to understand about this code, and that's the on method. Node.js uses event handling extensively. Many classes in Node.js, like HTTP server or even HTTP request and response, are subclasses of the class event emitter. As the name says, an event emitter emits events. Each event has a name and can have one or more event handlers, aka event listeners. The on method here is a method in event emitter that allows us to add an event handler, which is a function, to an event which is specified by the event name. Another method that does the same thing is addListener, and both addListener and on can be called multiple times on the same event to register multiple event listener. There's also another method called once, which is used to register listeners that will be called only once. And then, of course, there are methods to remove listeners. We won't be using event listeners again in this video, but in the next one we'll come back to events and event listeners. So now we have a Node.js web application, and we can certainly run it using the Node runtime like this. By the way, to close it or to exit it, we just need to click Ctrl+C. In addition to using the Node runtime, there are two other ways to run it. During development, we can run it using the program or the utility called node_mon. Mon stands for monitor, I guess. Node_mon monitors the source files in a project, and whenever there's a change to the source code, it automatically restarts the program. So it's very convenient during development. If you want to deploy your Node.js web application onto a server, you can use the utility called PM2, which can run Node.js web applications as managed background processes. Now let's add node_mon to our application, and here, in fact, I already have it in my application here. But if I don't, and if I want to add it, I would use npm install node_mon and then --save diff. That means we want to save node_mon as a development dependency of the project. Node_mon provides a command line tool that we can use to run Node.js programs. And it used to be that those type of commands are installed as global packages. But nowadays, the general practice is to install this type of development tools as dev packages inside the project. So here, I already installed it, and then we can run it. Now, the issue is that if you install a command line tool like this as a development package, the executables provided by the tool is under this folder, node module/.bin, and it's not very convenient to run those tools because this folder is typically not on your system path. However, there is a second utility that we can use called npx. This one actually comes with your Node.js development kit, so you don't need to install it separately. This utility has two main usages. One, we can use it to run commands provided by packages installed within the project, like node_mon. For example, if I want to run node_mon, we can say npx and then node_mon, and then our application like this. And let's say we change something in our application. Let me make the window a little bit smaller so we can see the application automatically restarts. So let's say I change this one back to hello world. So notice that here, node_mon detects the change and automatically restart the program. And here we just need to refresh, and then we see the new code. Much more convenient than Ctrl+C to stop the program and then rerun the program. Again, if we want to exit, just Ctrl+C here. why it's not exiting. For some reason, node mount doesn't want to exit. Let me close that thing and try again. We'll do npx node mount. Web app. Control C. Okay. Didn't know what happened before, but Control C is supposed to end it. Okay. Anyway, so this is the first main usage of npx, is to run commands installed locally inside the projects. The second one is to use it to run some one-off commands without installing the package. For example, there's a package called git ignore. So if we go to here and search git ignore, there's a package called git ignore, and what it does is it automatically generates git ignore files for different types of projects. For example, if you want to generate a git ignore file for Node.js package, you'll say git ignore node. And if you want to see how many the type of projects it supports, you will say git ignore -types and so on. So normally for this type of package, you would need to install the package as a global package, and then you can use it. But because generating a git ignore file is not something that you do quite often, you do it only once at the beginning of a new project, and that's it. So you probably don't want to install git ignore as a package. You just want to run it once. And with npx, you can do that by running it without installing it as a package. For example, we can say npx, and then we can say git ignore, and we can say -type to see what type it supports, for example. And for -type, is it types? Okay, so it's types. Okay, so you can see that git ignore supports all kinds of object types, Java, for example, and Node, for example, and all kinds of others. So actually, I think I already have a git ignore file here, but let's remove that. So let's say I remove my git ignore file, and then let's regenerate it. And if I want to regenerate it, we'll say, or if you just created a new project and you want to create it a new one, you can say npx git ignore, and how do we specify type, or just type? So we'll say node. And it will generate a git ignore file for type node. And if we look at here, this is what it looks like. It automatically generates the git ignore file to ignore log files, PID files, a bunch of others and stuff. Okay, so git ignore, not too important. The main purpose of this is to show the two usages of npx: running local commands or running one-off commands without installing them as a package. Okay, so moving on, we saw that Node.js give us a HTTP package that allows us to create a HTTP server. But if we look at the code here, we can see that it will be actually quite difficult to develop any non-trivial web application with just the HTTP package, because request and response API provided by this package are just too low level. We'll need something that parses HTTP request to give us the request parameters, the JSON body, the uploaded files, and so on. And the Node.js HTTP package doesn't do that. We'll need something that does request mapping, aka routing, that maps requests to different controllers. We'll need sessions, support for views, some built-in error handling, and so on and so forth. So basically, we need a web application framework, something like Spring. There are many web frameworks out there, and many web frameworks for Node.js in particular. The web framework we'll talk about today is called Express. The E in the min stack and the MERN stack. Comparing with Spring, Express is much simpler. Spring is known as a minimalistic framework in the sense that it only provides the very basic functions of a web framework. And that's not a bad thing, because A, it makes Express quite easy to learn, much easier to learn than Spring. And B, most of the time, you really just need those basic functions. So by using Express, you are not burdened with a library that has lots of features that you don't need. If you do want more from a web framework, there are plenty of others that add additional features on top of Express. So, for example, if you feel Express itself is not quite enough, then there are a bunch of other frameworks, some of them quite popular and quite useful, that are built on top of Express, and then you can look into those and see if they have the features you need. Express is also known as an unopinionated framework. In programming terms, this basically means that it allows you to do things in pretty much any way you want, instead of forcing you to do things in a certain way. That's another advantage in my book. But some people may think that too many choices are bad. If the framework forces you to do in one way, it's easier to know that, hey, this is the way. But I kind of like Express. Just giving the basic tools, play with it in any way you want. Okay, so let's start with a simple example of Express. Hello world again, of course. The first thing we want to do is install the Express package. I don't think I have installed it yet. No. So we'll first do npm install Express. Okay, so then let's create a new file. We'll call it Express Web App. Excuse me. And let's copy over this code. Okay, so this is the hello world of Express. And again, let's first run it, make sure it runs, and then we'll look at some additional things. we'll use node mount to run it. So we'll do node mount express web app. If you look at this code, even though we don't know all the details, you can probably guess that this is a port number, this is a path, this one will send a response that says hello world. So we'll head over to localhost 3000. Indeed, it says hello world. And let's change to 5220. Come back, refresh. Okay, so it works. Now, the main thing in this example, of course, is the application object, the one that we get by calling express or here. This is the application is the object that handles routing, rendering views, configuring middleware, and so on. We'll talk about middleware in a moment. But first, let's look at routing. Routing, as we mentioned, is to map requests to certain controller methods or action methods if you want. And in Express, routing is actually pretty straightforward. So if you think about it, when it comes to routing, you just need three things. You need a path, you need a function that handles the request to that path, and oftentimes you also need to have a request method, because if, as we know from designing REST API, for the same path, if the request method is a GET, it may mean certain operation, and if the request method is POST, it may mean some other operation. So to do routing in Express is really just three things: a path, a function that handles requests to that path, and the request method that does additional selecting whether certain operations should be performed based on the request method. So if you look at the API, the request method part is specified as the method name of the application object. So this one could be get, post, put, patch, delete, and so on. And then you have path, and then you have a function that handles the request to that path. So let's see a few more examples. And here we have a route that's to the root path, and using the get method. And let's say we do another one. We'll say hello, and this one will send back a response as this is path hello. And if we do /hello, it will get here. Now let's say instead of a get request, I want to send a post request. So a post request is better we do that with Postman instead of browser. So let me copy it over here. And if we do a get request, we get the response. And if we do a post request, we get an error page that says cannot post. If I change this one to post and send again, and now it gives me the response. And if you look at the documentation, you can see that there are a bunch of methods corresponds to request methods, get, post, patch, delete, put, and stuff. And there's also a special method called all, and as you can probably guess, all means any request method will be mapped to this route. So if I change this to all, then I can use a post method or post request, I can use a get request, I can use a put request, and all of them will give us the same response. So this is the basics about the routing part. As I said, it's really a pretty simple framework, much simpler than Spring. So there's not too much about it. That being said, you probably noticed that in the API, for each path, you can actually specify multiple callback functions or multiple functions handling a request. Now, you may be wondering how a request can be processed by multiple functions. The short answer is that the functions will be chained together, and the request will be processed by the first one, and then it will be passed on to the second one, the third one, and so on. These functions are, in fact, what's called middleware in Express. We'll talk about middleware more in a moment. Now, we can do routing directly in the application object. But if the web application is complex, having all the routes in application becomes difficult to manage. Remember, in Spring, we would put all the routes related to one resource in a controller class, like a users controller or files controller. With Express, we can do the same thing, except that now it's called a router. So this is what a router in Express looks like. You would say Express router, and it returns a router object. Or you can think of a router object as a mini application object, meaning that just like application, you can do router.get and a path, router.post, path, and so on and so forth. And then you can attach that router to the application at a certain point. This is often known as mounting a router at a certain path, and then any request to that path and the path under it will be handled by the code inside the router. So to see how this works, let's quickly do something like that. I'll create another script. I'll call it express users. Let's just say users, and let's say we will do something like this, and we'll get a router, and then if we get a GET request at the root of this router, we'll send back something that says, okay, this one should be request. We'll send back something like list all users. And then if I do something like this, and we'll say added a new user, we'll do something. We'll add more later, or not. But yeah, this should be enough to show the router thing. So You can think of this as basically a user's controller. It's equivalent to a user's controller in a Spring Boot application. For example, you would have a class has a bunch of action methods in the class, and each action method handles a certain endpoint. And then we can come back to the main program, and of course the first thing is we would want to import that module, and that module is called express users, and this let's call it user router, or you can call it user controller. I sometimes call it user controller because it's like a controller. And then let's mount it. We'll mount users router at the path users. Let's put it here. Just, yeah, it shouldn't matter, but let's put it there. And now if we go to users, so something was wrong, and express is not defined. Okay, so we didn't import express. So we'll need to put express here, and then let's try again. And cannot put users. Why? Oh, need to change this one to get. Okay, so this is supposed to be the list all users endpoint, and if we change this to post, it will say added a new user. So this one hits this endpoint. So this is how we use routers. Again, each router is like a controller class in Spring. Okay, so now that we know how routing works, we need to take a closer look at request and response in Express. In particular, we need to know what information we can get out of a request object, and how we can generate different responses using the response object. As always, you should have a look at the API documentation when you have time. So this would be the request object, and if you look at the left menu, you can see all the properties of the request and all the methods of the request. There are not that many. All in all, Express is a, as they say, minimalistic, really quite easy to pick up. Anyway, I listed some important things here. If you want to get a header from a request, you use a get method. It looks like here. For example, if you want to get a content type, you'll just say request get header name, and it will return header value. And more importantly, to get user input, you can get user input in several different ways. If the user input comes in as request parameters, or in other words, the query strings, you would use request.query. If they are coming in as route parameters, or in Spring we call this path variables, you would use request.params. If they are coming in from form submission, you will get them in request body, and again, if it comes in request body as a JSON object, you can also get it from request body. So yeah, we'll see an example in a moment. Now, request object give us the tools to get information out of a request, and response object, of course, give us the tools to generate response. So there are two basic ways to generate response. You can send an object back as JSON using the response JSON method, and if it's not JSON, then you can use send to send any other type of data. If you want to set status, you can use the status method. Status method. Where is the status method? Here. Okay. Like this. If you, for example, want to set a status 403, you can use the status method. But unlike the send and the JSON method, if you set the status using the status method, it does not end the response. If you don't want to add anything to the response, or if you want to send back an empty response just with a status code, then you have to call the method end. So that's different from JSON and send, which automatically end the response. And then you can do redirect using the redirect method. Okay, so knowing that, let's try a few things. So let's say we want to add two numbers or two strings together. Doesn't really matter. And we can specify those two as two request parameters or query parameters. We can specify them as path variables or route parameters. We can submit them in a form, and we can specify them as a JSON object inside the request body. So depending on how we send in the data, there are different ways to get them in Express application. So let's do that here. So let's say we do f, we do f or no, we do f get, and let's say we'll say /add and request response, and inside the method we'll say send back. What do we send back? We'll send back request query A plus request dot query B. So notice that the request parameter names are A and B, and because they are request parameters, we use, or in particular they are query parameters, we use request.query, and then we say the parameter name A, parameter name B. So if we try that, we'll say question mark A is 10 and B is 20. And we cannot post to add. Okay, we need to use get. Change this one to get and then send. We get 10, 20. So it's a string concatenation rather than addition, but that's okay. If you want addition, just convert A and B to integer and then add them up. So this is how we can get request parameters from query string. Simply just say query and then the parameter name. So what if the request comes in as route parameters or path variables, as we call them in Spring. Well, pretty simple. We can do something like this. We can say the first one is A, and then the second one is B, and then let's just change this to params.a and then params.b, and that will do it. So, oops, let me close this. So here, instead of a question mark, we'll say add /1000 and 200. And if we click send, it will give us 1000 and then 200. And that tells us that we are picking up the two route parameters. Here, as you can see, the syntax inside the method is similar to before, except that instead of query, we say params. Also note the syntax here. When we specify it in the path, we say column and then name, column, then name. In Spring, it will be braces, but here it's just column, but that's the same thing. Okay, so what if we want to send the data in from a form submission? Well, that's where we use request.body. So we'll change this one to post and remove this one, and we'll say request body A and request body B, and here we'll change this one, and I think I send the request. Okay, so then we'll come to body, and a regular form is form URL encoded. We'll say A is 20 and then B is 30, and then send. Now, if we just do this, we will get an error, and not the error I'm expecting. So this one should be post. Let's try this again and change this one to post. I didn't remember to do that. And here it says an error that says cannot read property A something something. Now, the reason for that is because we need something that can parse a request body to give us A and B, and by default, Express doesn't do that. In order to do that, we'll have to add a Express middleware called URL encoded. This middleware will parse a request body and pick out the request parameters from form submission. So grab this one and put it somewhere here. And then if we try again, it will give us 2030, meaning that now this middleware successfully parsed the request body, and so once the code hits this line, the request body has a property called A and a property called B corresponding to the A and B request parameters submitted from the form. So similarly, we can change this one to JSON, and we'll add a content type header, and we'll say the content type is application JSON, and the body, of course, is, let's say A is 100 and B is 1. Actually, let me change them to strings because because I suspect that if there are numbers, there will be an error. But let's first use them as strings, and similar to URL encoded middleware, in order to parse JSON request object, we have to use another middleware called express JSON. So let's put that one here. And if we do that, we don't actually need to change the code, because whether it's a form submission or whether it's JSON, both will be attached to the request.body property. So don't need to change this part. And if we send this, it will give us 101, which is correct. Now, in case you are curious, if we change this one to numbers, we'll actually get an error here, I think. Yeah, well, not quite an error. So if you notice here, what it's doing is that if it treats these two as two numbers, then what happens is that when we do rs send, it will send that number as the status code rather than the content of the response. Meaning that if you try to send a number using the method send, it will actually treat it as if you are trying to send a status code. So that's why it's not giving us the correct value. So to fix that, let's just convert this thing into strings. So that should give us the same results as before. So that is pretty much it about the basic requests and responses, I think. Yeah. Okay, so now we need to talk about the subject about middleware, which is a very important concept in Express framework. As we just saw, we can add middlewares like URL encoded or JSON to parse request bodies. And so what are they? In Express, a middleware is actually just a function. And this function takes 3 arguments: request, response, and next. As shown in this figure, each middleware function gets a request object, a response object. They can do some processing on the request and or the response object, and then they can call the next function to pass the request and response to the next middleware function. Now, if it doesn't call the next function, the rest of the middleware in the pipeline will be skipped, and the response gets sent back directly to the client. So that's how middleware works, and it's pretty straightforward, in fact. Now, knowing that, we can create our own middleware. It's quite simple. Really, it's just a function that takes request response and then next. Now, what you can do with middleware is up to you. But let's just say that we want to create a middleware that does some logging. It will print out the request method, request URI, and stuff. So we can do that fairly easily. And so, for example, we can say, let's create a function called request logger. And remember, it needs to take 3 arguments: request, response, and next. And then inside, let's say, we'll print out what? the request method, and then the request path. Yeah, let's just print out request method and request paths. Now, very importantly, if we want to have this middleware to forward request and response to the next middleware, we need to call the third argument. It's a function, so we'll just call it like this. And oftentimes you would want to say return next, and making sure that the function will be terminated when you call next. And then, just like any other middleware, you just add it to the application, and that's pretty much it. So now you can see that is body password directly to then define extended provider. Okay, it's a warning, we can ignore it. I think it's there's an option we need to specify to the URL encoded middleware, but we can ignore that for now. So if we send that request, and we can see that our request logger actually logged that request, and if we send a request from here, and the request logger also logged that request. So this is how middleware works. It's actually quite simple. Just a function with 3 arguments, and you do something with the request and or the response, anything you want, and then pass them on by calling next. So yeah, you can also add middleware at the router level using router use instead of app use. A few things about middleware. First of all, know that the route handler functions are also middleware, meaning these ones are actually middleware functions. But if you look at our code, you can see that typically we only take 2 arguments, not 3. You may be wondering what happens to the third one. Well, remember that JavaScripts are very flexible about function arguments. So you can specify 2 parameters here, but the framework can still pass you 3 arguments. The third argument, if you don't need it, you don't need to specify it here. But you could do it like this. Excuse me. For example, let's not do it there, but let's do it here. For example, if you want to have more than 1 functions processing that request, you can take the third argument, and then you can, let's say do something here, and say, actually we can say request request foo is bar. We add a new property to the request object, and then we can call next, and then we can add another one here. So this one will be a second request handler function, and this one, after this one is done, and this one gets the request and response, and this one will say, what would it say? It will say response send hello request foo. and it will say hello bar. What this one says is that this callback functions or request processing functions are really also middleware functions, and you can chain them together by using the next method, next function call. And if the first one is done, it can call next, and the next one can use whatever provided by the first one. So yeah, route handler functions are also middleware, and of course, if you look at this figure, you can see that the order of the middleware is very important. Which one is in front, which one is after, definitely affect how things will work. So when you have multiple middleware functions, make sure that they are ordered properly. Okay, so that is about the regular middleware functions, and then there's another types of middleware function that's used to handle errors. Error handling middleware has an actual argument error, so just like any other Node.js API design, it's error first. So error handling middleware will have 4 arguments, and the first one is the error argument. Error is of course an error object in JavaScript, so basically exception object. When some error happens, if you call next error, it will bypass the rest of the regular middleware and pass control to the next error handling middleware. And if you don't have any error handling middleware, that's okay. Express as a default one at the end of the middleware chain. So to see that, to see how that works, let's do something that creates an error object. Okay, so I'll have a high path, and this high path will have an error. So let's just let's create a new error object and say something bad happened. Yeah. So if we look at here, let's say we go to high. So we see that the default error handling middleware will create a HTML page or an error page, and inside the body it will show the error message, something bad happened, and a bunch of other stuff. So let's say that suppose we are doing a REST API instead of a web application. That means instead of error page, we want to have a JSON response with a proper status code. So instead of relying on the default error handling middleware, maybe we want to create our own. So that's what we will do. What we'll do is we will use, and then we'll create a function that takes 4 arguments. And so this time I'm just going to use an anonymous function instead of creating a function and then put it in. So I'm just going to use an anonymous function. In fact, I'm going to use an arrow function. We'll say error request response, and then what's the third one? Fourth one, next. And here, this should get the error when the error happens, And what we do is we say response status, and let's set a status 500, and then let's send back a JSON response. A JSON response will be an object, and let's just say, we'll say message is whatever the message of the error. Okay, so something like this. And if we send the same request again, so now you can see that we get a proper status 500 status code, and we also get the response as a JSON object instead of a error page. So this is how we can create and use error handling middleware. Pretty straightforward. All things considered, Express framework is really much easier to learn than some of the other more complex frameworks, which is a good thing in my opinion. Anyway, this is our coverage of the basics about Express framework. We'll talk a little bit more about Express framework in the next video. So this is it for this one. See you in the next video.